Indeed. Axial Age. Robert M. Bellah, The Heritage of the Axial Age, Resource or Burden. In this presentation, I will not regurgitate the material that we all presumably read. Thus, I will not, for example, spend a lot of time on the history of the movement, as I feel Bellah did in this article to a great degree. Rather, I will give the background to the so-called Axial Age itself, as I find that topic to be extremely perplexing, confounding, but illuminative at the same time. Is there even such a thing as an axial age? If so, what is it? And why would Bellah write this article within the book and others that I will elucidate in my notes at all? What is the significance of the actual age? Why are we reading about something that occurred 2,000 years ago, roughly? Isn't this supposed to be a classical theories of religion course? And by that I mean classical in the sense of classical English being Shakespeare, classical biology being 17th century biology, classical stories being, of course, in the 17th century. That's what I first perceived classical to mean. Now, when referring to antiquity, I generally refer to it as antiquity or antiquitous, what have you. But nevertheless, so in reference to classical theories of religion, I'm considering it to be the onset of modernity onward. But as I hope to make clear in this presentation, the actual age that occurred 2,000 years ago is extremely important. And it's direly important to understanding the classical theories of religion, I do contend. The context here is notable from which our text is taken. The chapters in that collected volume are revised versions of papers presented at the actual age and its consequences for subsequent history and the present conference held in Germany. I'm not going to try to pronounce that Erfurt or what have is it okay. Right. In 2008. The chapters on the actual age in Robert Bellah's work the chapters on the actual age in Robert Bellah's then work in progress entitled Religion and Human Evolution were distributed to the conference members prior to the arrival on site. Not to be the subject of the conference per se, but rather to give the background and sort of a stimulus instead to the discussion. It is, however, worth noting that these are the last four substantive chapters in Bellah's book, the one previously referenced, Religion and Human Evolution, and that they are preceded by chapters on the deep biological evolution of capacities that would make religion possible once our species had evolved. Also, he notes that religion evolved among largely egalitarian tribal peoples in that book. Religion evolved, if you will, among chiefdoms, that is, early hierarchical societies, and religion in the great Bronze Age monarchies of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, that is, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China. Bellah's book, Religion and Human Evolution, ends with the actual age and is much more concerned with its background than its consequences. So while the conference from the beginning contemplated including papers dealing with the consequences of the actual age, Bellah, though he alludes briefly to some of the consequences in the final chapter of his book, is there mainly concerned with the actual age itself in relation to what preceded it. The editors of the volume from which our reading is drawn, that is the actual age and its consequences, left the matter of whether contributors would write about the actual age, its background, or its consequences entirely up to the contributors. Most of the contributors did not write about the background or its consequences, etc. They assumed knowledge of the actual age instead. As such, I contend there's a gap, so to speak, of background knowledge regarding the actual age in the text from which our reading is drawn this morning that I asked you to focus on prior to class. Nevertheless, I will in fact begin where Bella ends, in noting that the actual age gave us a theory in two senses, both of them which have been problematic ever since. The great utopian visions bequeathed by the actual age have motivated some of the noblest achievements of humanity, but they have also motivated some of the most dastardly actions of human beings. Theory in the sense of disengaged knowing, that is, inquiry for the sake of understanding, with or without moral evaluation, has brought its own kind of astounding achievements, but it has also given powers to humans to destroy their environment as well as themselves. Both kinds of theory have been criticized, or rather I should say, both kinds of theory have criticized, but also justified the class society from which it drew. That is the actual age. Both kinds of theory also have provided the intellectual tools for efforts to reform and efforts to repress. In many senses, rather, it is a great heritage. I doubt that any of us modern-day humans or postmodern-day humans would desire to live in the preaxial age. Yet it is a heritage of explosive potentialities for both good and evil. It has given us a great tool of criticism, in fact. How will we use what we learn of the actual age? The phrase axial age originated with the German psychiatrist and philosopher Karl Jaspers. I think I pronounced that correct. Jaspers, ideal. Who noted that during the period of the actual age, there was a shift, or a turn, if you will, as if on an axis, a turn on an axis, away from a more predominantly localized concern toward transcendence. Axial age thinkers displayed great originality and yet exhibited surprising similarity with respect to their ultimate concerns. For example, Indian thinkers came to think of karma, that is, the residual effects of past actions, as having direct impact upon human life, and they proposed solutions for how humans could attain liberation, that is, moksha, or moksha, from karma's effects. In fact, numerous religions arose or concretized during this time frame. Chinese thinkers, for example, who were striving to unify the kingdom and avert civil war, both disputed and debated the appropriate way, that is the Tao, for human society. Also, the Hebrew prophets around this time came to view the God of Israel as the God who created the heavens and the earth and who shaped destiny thereafter. Further, the tradition of Zoroastrianism conceived of human history as a microcosm of the cosmic struggle to choose good or evil, to choose good over evil, rather, I should say. Yet in all these cases, the representative thinkers saw themselves as postulating solutions to life's questions and problems, not only for themselves but also for others, or even their culture, that is, humankind as a whole. So then there was a movement from a personal viewpoint to a more corporate or social viewpoint, toward a transcendence, if you will, as Bella terms it, a transcendence of thought. Bella and Jonas note that by seeing the actual age as the period of the emergence of formative traditions of religious and philosophical thought, the contributors to the volume from which our text is taken are not implying that culture began in the actual age per se, and that what went before it can be ignored. Rather, it is true that there are no classics in the sense defined above that precede the first millennium BCE. The tale of Gilgamesh might be a notable exception, though it has only marginally entered the canon of worldwide literature. But even so, it is the exception that proves the rule. Nevertheless, the actual age is only intelligible in terms of what went before it. That is, a very long and very significant history in which human culture did emerge as a way of relating to the world shared by no other animal. To date, most theorists have suggested that the nature of the actual age was cognitive or intellectual. In particular, it has often been argued that during the actual age, people began to be more reflexive, quote unquote. For instance, Jaspers originally defined reflexivity as general consciousness and as thinking about thinking, quote unquote. He notes, hitherto unconsciously accepted ideas, customs, and conditions were subjected to examination, questioned, and liquidated, end quote. This radical questioning of tradition led, Jaspers claims, to monotheism in the eastern part of the eastern Mediterranean and to the birth of philosophy in the western part of the Mediterranean. As local and tradition-specific as their investigations may have begun, their concerns were global, even universal. Key point. The actual age people, when they arose, the actual age tradition, when it arose, had a global focus, had a universal even focus. As such, the appearance of thinkers who were still a source of inspiration for present-day religious and spiritual movements marked the actual age. Indeed, for example, Socrates, Pythagoras, Buddha, Mahavira, Confucius, Lao Tse, I probably didn't pronounce, is that okay? And the Hebrew prophets, etc., etc., etc. But by contrast, the Egyptian, Greek, and Mesopotamian religions have had little to no impact upon today's religious and spiritual life. Thus, the actual age was defined with reference to modern religions and the modern world, you could say. People who lived before the actual age lacked much self-reflection and lacked the concepts, the ideas, and the thoughts related to such awareness. People who lived on the latter side of the actual age were essentially contemporary, quote unquote, in respect to their psychology. Key point. Indeed, before the actual age transformation, humans told one another myths and other stories about how they came to be. These stories were not regarded as true or false per se, but instead their truth did not require questioning. Such were human beings at the time, Karl Jaspers believes, because of a lack of self-reflective, fully conscious self-understanding. During the actual age, however, some scholars argue that a dramatic shift took place in human thought across 4 geographically distinct regions of the world: India, China, the Middle East, and Greece. New ways of thinking thereafter emerged or evolved during this time that defined the world's psychological culture ever since then. What was new about this age is that humans became conscious of both being and being, if that makes sense. Being with a capital B and being with a lowercase b. That is individual being and the being which underlies all human beings. Also, this age was distinct in that people became aware of themselves and their limitations, etc., at least according to Jaspers. They, in fact, began to ask radical questions. By consciously recognizing their limits, humans set goals and so on. Therefore, or I should say, thereupon, presumably unrealized. Jasper proposes that some highly important, at least from our context today anyway, questions first appeared in this period that were specifically psychological in nature. For example, humans began to query, who am I and why are people different, just to name 2. Perhaps as a consequence of the above questioning, wisdom teachings emerged across those 4 geographic areas that I earlier elucidated. In India, for example, new Hindu doctrine included a great degree of reflection and analysis. Buddhism and Jainism both also emerged as well, similarly self-reflected and analytical. China saw Confucianism, Taoism, and the 100 Schools. Iran saw Zoroastrianism amalgamate. In the Middle East, Judaism coalesced and changed from its non-reflective earliest writings to a more human-focused perspective epitomized as evidenced by the books of the Hebrew Bible and by Rabbinic Judaism. And also, finally, Greek philosophy explored the human mind and argued for self-knowledge. After the transformation of the Axial Age, qualities such as courage, solidarity, and kindness were explicitly valued and spoken of by religious and other wisdom writings. As such, the Axial Age most pointedly refers to the period during which most of the main religions and spiritual traditions emerged in Eurasian societies. The Axial Age has recently been the focus of increasing interest, but its very existence is still very much in dispute, as a matter of fact. The main reason for this questioning of the Axial Age is that its nature, as well as its spatial and temporal boundaries, remain very much unclear. The standard explanation to the Axial Age defines it as a change of cognitive style, that is, from a narrative and analogical style to a more analytical and reflective style, probably due to the increasing use of external memory tools during this period of time, such as writings, so forth like that. But Baumard et al. Proffers that a change in reward orientation, that is, from a short-term materialistic orientation to a long-term spiritual one, was the proximate cause for the Axial Age. And I frankly find that somewhat convincing. I like Baumard's contentions. I had joy in reading through his paper. You can find it there in the footnote. The evolutionary psychologist Merlin Donald has profoundly influenced Robert M. Bella's work on religion and human evolution. And it is Donald's chapter in the book from which our text is drawn that goes most deeply into the background without which the Axial Age is unintelligible. Donald traced in that article the evolution of human culture through 4 stages, with the first being episodic culture, being shared with other higher mammals. But distinctly human culture begins with mimetic culture, in which meanings were expressed through bodily actions and gestures, and language was absent or only incipient, and then goes on to mythical culture, wherein full human language allowed narratives to arise and myth to form the focus of cultural organization. The fourth and final cultural capacity to arise in this era, according to Donald, was the emergence of a theoretic culture, giving the possibility of universalizable discourse, but not replacing any earlier cultural form. In Donald's fourfold schemata, each form of culture is reorganized with the emergence of successive capacities, but not abandoned. In recent years, Bella has proposed to use Donald's theory of cognitive change to explain the Axial Age. According to Donald's theory, human culture has gone through 3 main transitions. 1, from ape culture to mimetic culture, which, by the way, is marked by an increase of executive functioning. 2, from mimetic culture to mythic culture, which, by the way, is marked by the emergence of linguistic symbols. And 3, from mythic culture to theoretic culture, which is marked by the invention of writing. According to Bella, the Axial Age corresponds to the tradition from mythic to theoretic culture. That is, the Axial Age then signifies the transition from oral cultures largely to writing cultures. It should be understood that the transition from the mythic to the theoretic mode, although it is a radical step in human cognitive evolution, was cultural in its origins. Biologically, we are much the same creatures as the people who lived during the Axial Age. And in the cognitive domain, they were probably similar to their ancestors only a few thousand years before that. There's no good evidence, suggesting otherwise. Theoretic culture emerged largely from a series of cumulative cultural innovations on the part of creative individuals. It was cultural, not biological per se. However, these innovations changed the nature of the cognitive games people played and eventually altered how we perceive, how we think, how we remember, and how we conceive of reality. They changed, in essence, our sense of selfhood. These were, in fact, radical changes. However, we should not assume that there was any serious evolution of basic mental capacity during this time frame, in the biological sense, that is, during the Axial Age per se. It was cultural instead. Cultural. M. Donald asserts that human cultures are by nature cognizing entities. That is, cognitive activity is an integral part of their definition. Thus, human cultures can perceive, they can remember, they can decide, they can construct worldviews, and they can represent reality. Cultures can do that. The field of cognitive science is typically identified with the study of single individuals, as if the mind were locked in an individual brain. However, humans have a shared knowledge base, which is anchored in culture, and also which is not restricted to the experience of individuals, but is substantially wider and deeper than any single individual's comprehension of it instead. The cognitive activities of a culture are organized, governed, and distributed across an entire population group. No individual mind can encompass the knowledge of an entire culture, therefore. Rather, a cultural knowledge base is stored in culture, that is, displayed and refined in the public domain, and remembered by the group, not the individual per se. The gradual process of co-evolving of the hominid brain and culture, insomuch as individuals increasingly fall under the sway of their cultures, might be called, quote-unquote, emergent enculturation. I'm using the term emergent there in the sense defined, articulated, and expounded upon by Philip Clayton. Note. And indeed, a range of characteristics given to theoretic culture by Donald do appear to have been central in the Axial Age, as it is defined by the standard cognitive approach referenced above. For example, in the mythic culture, people were more narrative-based. In the theoretic culture, they were more analytically based. In the mythic culture, they were more based upon authority, whereas in the theoretic culture, they were based upon evidence. In the mythic culture, they were slow and deep, whereas in the theoretic, they were fast and shallow. I'm going to skip down there because you've got that before you as well. In the mythic culture, they were more allegorically grounded, whereas in the theoretic culture, we became more analytically grounded. In the mythic culture, we were orally based, whereas in the theoretic culture, we were more technologically based. According to the aforementioned Merlin Donald, the key element in the emergence of a theoretic culture is the arrival of external symbolic memory technology. That is, the memory gain or the memory knowledge gained through external forms such as writing, lists, scriptures, etc. All these things prolifically enhance an individual human's ability to reflect upon their own thoughts and challenge their prior beliefs, which eventually led to a new kind of culture and a new way of dealing with the world. But Baumard et al. From 2015 characterized the actual age based not upon a cognitive change, but upon a behavioral one. For example, in harsh religious environments, the orientation was short-term, but in affluent ones, they were more long-term. In the harsh environments for religions prior to the actual age transformation, people were positive toward money and conspicuous consumption, whereas after the actual age or during and after the actual age, in the affluent environment, people were negative or ambivalent toward conspicuous consumption. You can read through that as you will. Indeed, as we can see from the above figure, Baumard et al. Argue that real change is the emergence of self-discipline and selflessness, which were new at the time and which today form and serve as the core of world religions. Again, allow me to repeat. The real change, according to Baumard et al., was that during the actual age, the emergence of self-discipline and selflessness arose. According to this view, the reason why such figures as Buddha, the Stoics, and Confucius are still read today is that they proposed a new way of life in which morality and self-discipline are central. On this view, the actual age is a major psychological change from a period in which short-term orientations dominated toward a period in which longer-term orientations became dominant. These behavioral changes concern cooperative behavior, that is, compassion and charity, for example, and sexual behaviors, chastity and monogamy, as well as economic behaviors, that is, greed and conspicuous consumption, as well as parenting behaviors, marked notably by the higher investment in children. In short, according to Baumard et al., these changes represent a major psychological transformation, which themselves reflect a dramatic evolution and expansion of the human mind, in contradistinction to Donald before. Donald says that it was behavior-based. Donald says that it's more not based upon behavior and does not reflect an expansion of the human mind. Baumard says no. The human mind did in fact correlate with the expansion of behavior. Indeed, in this theory of Baumard's et al., religion is viewed as just the tip of the iceberg, that is, a reflection of a deeper, more intuitive and automatic psychological change based upon cognitive advancements. Religious commandments and beliefs, notably afterlife punishment and rewards, are not advantageous by themselves. Rather, they become both desirable and desired because they justify and legitimize a wide range of new behaviors that emerged in the Eurasian higher, that is, more affluent cultures or strata. Accordingly, actual age doctrines were associated with a variety of beliefs, including polytheism, for example, Taoism, Buddhism, and most Greek sects, dualism, for example, Manichaeism, and monotheism, Christianity. It's also marked by the appearance of non-theistic worldviews, for example, the Stoics. In some, there may be debate about the particularities of the so-called actual age. However, there's none absolutely question about its importance. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Brad, for this very helpful sort of placing of the idea of the axial age in a biological and cognitive context. I think your point about the difference between more cognitive approaches, Garo, and more behavioral approaches is an important one, and reflects an important debate that runs through a number of disciplines, but of course is relevant here as well.
Ideal. Yes, sir.
Questions to the presentation? Or rather to the presenter of the presentation?
Right.
Well, then let me just ask you about one figure that occurs a number of times in your footnotes, but I would argue does not exist. Now, look at, for example, that's page 3. When you refer, that reoccurs, right?
Okay.
To a volume edited by Robert Steller and Hans Jonas. Now, there is a Hans Jonas, but he is not the Hans Jonas. It is Hans Jonas.
Oh, gotcha. I totally, I guess visually transposed, I guess, that in.
Just check this out. It's regularly wrong in the footnote.
Okay.
Now, do you know Hans Jonas? Anyone heard of him? He's a Chicago sociologist who sort of works in Chicago, more or less on the same kind of schedule as I do. He spends half a year in Berlin and is half a year in Chicago, working in the area of sociology of religion. And he was one of the organizers of the conference you referred to, because before he moved to Berlin, he was at Erfurt University. And he's done in Chicago. And it is important to keep Chicago in mind, because Chicago is the place, as we shall see and hear more about in the next weeks,